So yesterday's class, we talked all about chemical digestion. So in the stomach, we have the digestion of proteins into polypeptides, but not much else. In the mouth, we have a little bit of digestion of starch, but again, not much. The bulk of digestion of our chemical digestion of our food occurs in the small intestine. So this I think you have this in your textbook, but I kind of chopped it up a little bit. And I just want to look at each category of macromolecules separately and at each part of the GI tract separately to see what happens where. So complex carbohydrates, things like starch, I would say cellulose, but we know that cellulose is indigestible, meaning we don't have the enzymes to digest cellulose. So really what we're talking about here is starch. So in the mouth, what happens to starch? Little bit of digestion, a little bit of chemical digestion of starch into maltose by salivary amylase. Is there any starch digestion in the stomach? No, none at all. There's no enzymes. That salivary amylase that's secreted in your mouth, once it hits the pH of the stomach, it's inactivated, so it doesn't work in the stomach. There's no digestion of complex carbs in the stomach. What about the small intestine? Yeah, that's where the majority of it happens. So we get pancreatic amylase that's secreted, and that's where we have the digestion of polysaccharides. Disaccharidases also are secreted by the small intestine, things like lactase, maltase, and sucrase. And by the time our food leaves the duodenum, all the complex carbs and disaccharides have been digested down to monosaccharides. All right? Now, what about proteins? Any protein digestion in the mouth at all? No. Stomach? Yes. What enzyme is involved in digestion of proteins in the stomach? Pepsin, right? Not pepsinogen, because pepsinogen is inactive. Pepsin. Anything else in the stomach? No. So all we have are large proteins digested into polypeptides by pepsin. So we still have lots and lots of protein and lots of polypeptides left. So it's again in the duodenum where the other proteases take over. Anybody remember some of the names of the other proteases in the small intestine? Starts with a T, one of them. Anyone remember? Yeah, trypsin, and then a class of them that starts with an E. Remember? Eripsins, right? So the other proteases, trypsin, eripsins. We didn't talk about chymotrypsin, so don't worry about that one. And then other peptidases come into play, and we eventually, by the time our food leaves the duodenum, all the proteins have been digested down to their amino acids. All right? What about fats? Any digestion of fats in the mouth? No. Any digestion of fats in the stomach? No. So all fat digestion occurs in the duodenum. Is bile an enzyme? No, bile is not an enzyme. Bile is not involved in the chemical digestion of fat. It's involved in the emulsification of fat, which is physical digestion. Okay, so the large fat droplets are broken down into smaller fat droplets so that the lipases can go to work and digest the lipids down into their glycerol and fatty acids. Right? And finally, nucleic acids. No nucleic acid digestion in the mouth, no nucleic acid digestion in the stomach, and we have nucleic acid digestion in the duodenum. All right, so you guys have a summary chart of this in your notes. You can find this PowerPoint on the Google site if you would like to look at this diagram. Yeah. Other way around. Hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen come together to make pepsin. Yeah. And pepsin only works under very strict pH conditions, so only around a pH of around 2 or 3. Okay, so that's why pepsin, which is involved in the breaking down of large proteins, why pepsin doesn't digest your small intestine. Because as soon as it hits the small intestine, remember bicarbonate ions are produced, and that takes the pH from around 2 or 3 all the way up to around 8 or 9. And that inactivates pepsin, and it doesn't work anymore, right? But it activates trypsin from trypsinogen, and that starts to digest the polypeptides. Yeah, so you're just a little confused there. It's hydrochloric acid plus pepsinogen equals the active form pepsin. Okay. Yeah, lots of little stuff, right? And I didn't even touch on the hormones here. So make sure you understand what gastrin does, what secretin does, what CCK does, and what GIP does. Also the role of bicarbonate ions and where all of those things are produced and what their targets are, right? So there's a lot here. I know we're covering this stuff really fast, but there's actually a lot to understand here. So that exam on Monday, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be ready for it, right? You guys kind of know the questions I'm going to ask you. You know the caliber of questions now from your previous exam. I'm going to ask you little stuff. You have to know that detail, right? We call it the minutia. You need to know that little detail stuff. Where the hormone is produced, what it causes, right? Where is bicarbonate produced? What does it do, right? Why? Well, because trypsinogen needs a particular pH to work, and pepsin won't work under those conditions anymore. So again, you need to know that little minutia. All right. So in my opinion, in this particular chapter, I would spend the most time getting to know this whole chemical digestion hormone interactions. Okay. And again, this is a really good diagram, kind of sums all of that stuff up. Here we have the different hormones that are secreted. So if you'll recall, CCK gets secreted by the small intestine when there is fat in the duodenum. And then CCK goes back to the gallbladder and causes it to squeeze, releasing bile, right? And that helps to break up those fat droplets. Secretin is secreted by the small intestine when there is acid in the small intestine. And what the secretin does is it goes to the pancreas, causes the pancreas to secrete bicarbonate, which is going to neutralize that acid. GIP, it's also secreted by the small intestine. And what it does is it tells the stomach to kind of slow down peristalsis. We don't want to dump the entire contents of the stomach into the duodenum all at once. We want to squirt a little bit of chyme into the duodenum a little bit at a time so that the enzymes have time to work on those macromolecules. So what GIP does is it just kind of slows down the stomach and allows the chemical digestion to occur in the duodenum. All right, and then finally gastrin. Gastrin is produced by the stomach. When the stomach gets full and it goes out and it tells those cells in the gastric pits to produce gastric juice, which includes mucus, pepsinogen, and hydrochloric acid. Okay, now there are other hormones involved in this entire process. There's something called leptin, there's something called ghrelin. We didn't talk about those. Those have to do with your hunger response in your brain. So they say if you don't want to overeat, what you should do is go up for a helping of food, right? You eat your first plate of food and wait a few minutes, right? Because what happens is it takes a while for your stomach to stretch. And when your stomach stretches, it sends out these hormones that tell your brain that it's full. And it takes a bit of time for those hormones to actually reach your brain. So how many times does this ever happen to you? It happens to me all the time, right? Especially at big dinners like Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, right? You load up and you eat like crazy and you're like, oh man, that was delicious. And you fill your plate up again. And if you polish off that second plate, you are like ridiculously full. You're over full, right? Uncomfortably full. Whereas if you would have just waited a couple of minutes for your brain to register the fact that, oh, my stomach's full, you wouldn't have went back for that second plate to begin with, right? And that's those hormones taking a little bit of time to actually get to your brain. All right, so we didn't really cover those hormones. Don't worry about them. I think I made mention really quickly in the PowerPoints. But the hormones that I really want you guys to concentrate on are the ones that are up on this slide. Okay, so CCK, secretin, gastrin, and GIP. All right. Okay. So let's move on to the other processes in digestion, absorption and elimination. Now remember, the small intestine is the largest part of your GI tract. It's called the small intestine because the diameter of the tube basically is small. Okay, it's a very long organ. It's like I said, it's the longest part of your GI tract. It can be 10 or 12 feet long, and it's all coiled up kind of in your belly region. So when you're complaining of a stomach ache or stomach cramps, what you're really kind of feeling, if you're feeling it in your belly, is what's going on in your small and large intestine. Because remember, your stomach is up kind of where your ribs are, right? So why is the small intestine, why is it so long, and why does it have this small diameter? Because after the first 25 centimeters of the duodenum, the rest of the small intestine is involved in the absorption of these monomers that we just spent so much time breaking down. We've spent a lot of time and energy taking our food and breaking it down into these monomers. So the proteins are now amino acids. The polysaccharides and disaccharides are now monosaccharides. Okay, well, polysaccharides really we're talking about starch. The nucleic acids are nucleotides, and the fat is glycerol and fatty acids. So we're now down to the monomers, right? We're down to the building blocks of our macromolecules. So what we now need to do, and what our body puts a lot of energy in and a lot of space, is to take these monomers and actually absorb them into the bloodstream, where they'll be transported to every single cell in the body, right? Remember, amino acids will make up new proteins to make up new cellular structures. Monosaccharides, they'll either be stored as glycogen, as fat, or they'll be burnt in cellular respiration. The nucleotides will make new DNA for you, and the fatty acids and the glycerol will be rearranged into new fats for cell membranes, for adipose fat, for brown fat to keep you warm, all sorts of different fats in your body. All right, so all of these things need to be reabsorbed or absorbed and then reassembled into your body. So absorption occurs throughout the GI tract. In fact, there are certain things you actually absorb in your mouth. There are certain things you'll absorb in your stomach, but the majority of absorption occurs in the small intestine. So there are certain chemicals like alcohol, like THC in marijuana, like LSD, that the drug LSD acid, right? There are many different drugs, many different substances that are absorbed through the mucous membrane of your mouth. But things like amino acids, things like sugar, things like fat, that does not get absorbed in your mouth, nor does it get absorbed in your esophagus or your stomach. Again, alcohol, though, can make its way through your stomach directly in your stomach. This is why drinking alcohol on an empty stomach affects you so much more quickly than it does on a full stomach, because there's nothing to absorb that alcohol and slow the absorption. So as soon as it hits your mouth, really, and then into your stomach, it gets absorbed. A lot of other things, though, don't. And the bulk of absorption occurs in your small intestine, and your small intestine has evolved certain structures in it to aid in this absorption. All right. So glucose, amino acids, and the components of fats, all of those things are absorbed, the majority, in the small intestine. So after the duodenum. Now, somebody asked me, do I need to know the names of the other parts of the small intestine? No, you don't have to know jejunum and you don't have to know ileum. Okay. But duodenum, you do have to know, because that's where the majority of chemical digestion occurs. Do you have to know how long each part is? No. You just have to know that the small intestine is the longest part, okay? You have to know that the duodenum is the first part, but you don't have to know particular measurements, all right? But you do have to know how things are absorbed and which things are primarily absorbed where. So glucose, amino acids, and the components of fats are absorbed in the small intestine. If we were to take a section of small intestine and cut it in half and look at it in a microscope in cross section, that's what it would look like. So that's an actual picture from an electron microscope of a cross section of the small intestine. Notice that it is not smooth at all. It's not ridged like your stomach. It doesn't have rugae, but it's not smooth. What you should notice right away in this small intestine are all of these finger-like projections here, right? Looks like a bunch of fingers. Or have you ever seen kind of underwater footage where they have those kelp forests, right? And it's all waving back and forth? That's what your small intestine looks like. And what these things are called is they're called villi. And villi actually means fingers in Latin. So it's like we have billions and billions and billions of these little tiny finger-like projections all throughout the small intestine. And what these things do is they increase surface area. So if you look at my fist for a second, I could measure my fist and I could come up with the surface area of my fist, right? This is probably, I don't know, 10 centimeters by maybe 3 centimeters. So I probably have a 30 centimeter squared surface area. But if I all of a sudden do this, right, and like this, like the whole surface of my fist, and I measure all inside my fingers, all around the outside of my fingers, what have I done to my surface area? I've increased it by many, many, many times. Okay, and that's the object of these villi. It's to increase the surface area because what's going to happen here is the absorption of all of these molecules. And we don't want to waste one molecule of sugar. We don't want to waste one molecule of amino acid. Remember, our ancestors might not have eaten every day. They evolved in much different conditions than we exist today. So if they ate every 3 or 4 days, it was really important for them to absorb every molecule of sugar, every molecule of amino acid, right? Every molecule of glycerol and fatty acid, because if they didn't, that was waste, and that could have gone to fueling their body. So our bodies evolved to be incredibly efficient at absorbing this stuff. All right. Now, in addition to having villi, on top of each villi, there are microvilli. So it's like if I had little fingers on top of my fingers. So that even increases surface area even more. Now, embedded inside each of these villi are blood vessels called capillaries. So every one of these villi has its own little blood vessels to absorb these nutrients into the bloodstream. So again, if we take a look at the villi under a microscope, we'll notice that they're kind of fuzzy and they have microvilli on top of them. So all this stuff does by having these villi and these microvilli is to increase the efficiency of the absorption process. So we can squeeze every molecule out of the food we eat. This is why we have an obesity epidemic in our society right now, right? In Canada, over 50% of people are overweight or obese. And it's really, some of it isn't our fault because the food we eat is so calorie dense, it's so easy to come by, and our bodies are so good at absorbing this stuff and storing it, right? So we're geared toward putting on weight because that's kind of what it would have been an advantage to our ancestors. So amino acids, nucleic acids, monosaccharides, vitamins, water, all that stuff it gets absorbed. Water and vitamins to a lesser degree. We'll talk about that later on in the large intestine. But monosaccharides, amino acids, nucleic acids, they get absorbed or actively transported in some cases directly into the bloodstream. Now, fatty acids and glycerol, they don't get transported into the bloodstream because, again, they're fat, right? And it's fat and water, which is mostly what our blood is made of. They don't jive, so they need to have a little bit of they need a little bit of work until they can get into the bloodstream. So there's actually a different set of tubes that's separate from the blood. It's called the lymphatic system. It absorbs a lot of the fat first, where that fat is brought to the liver and it's processed. Okay, and these little tiny these vessels that are separate from the capillaries, the blood network, they are called lacteals. Okay, lacteals. So amino acids, nucleic acids, and sugar, they go directly into the bloodstream. Fats, they get absorbed into these lacteals where they're brought to the liver to be processed further. Okay? Now, I want you guys to make note of this, please. Now, there's a reason why I ask you, like a lot of other teachers, their note packages are really bare and you got to do a lot of writing. You'll notice that mine, there aren't that many blanks, right? And the blanks that I do have you fill in, I bold and highlight. So the reason I'm asking you to fill those particular blanks in is because they're important. And then when I actually highlight something, there's a pretty good chance that that's going to be a test item, okay? So monosaccharides and amino acids are actively transported into the blood out of the small intestine. What does that mean, actively transported? Did you guys learn about this in Science 10? What's the difference between passive and active transport? Yep. You got it, 100%. You nailed it. So active transport actually requires energy on the part of our body to pump these materials using special transport proteins from one place to another. Okay, so that's energy intensive to actually move the sugar and the amino acids into your bloodstream. On the other hand, fats, they diffuse. So is diffusion, is that active or passive transport? Does that require energy on your bodies? No, it's passive. All right, so diffusion is passive. That just means fats will just move on their own. So this absorption, active transport, passive transport, this takes place throughout the entire length of the small intestine, all 15 or 20 feet of it. It takes a long time for food to move through. Well, it's not really food anymore, right? It's all been digested. So it takes a long time for this kind of slurry of material to move through your GI tract. And as it kind of twists and turns through all that small intestine, comes into contact with all those villi and microvilli, particles that our body uses is taken out of that stuff and put into our bloodstream and our lacteals. Okay, so fats, carbohydrates, amino acids, they're all being taken out of that. Well, we'll call it food, okay, and absorbed into your bloodstream. Now, by the time the food gets to your large intestine, there's not really much left of it. All right, so the large intestine, again, it's given its name because of the diameter, not because of its length. The large intestine isn't actually that long. It's only about 1.5 meters long in a fully grown person. Right? Think of a meter stick. It's only a meter stick and a half long. And it kind of is like a picture frame around your small intestines. So there's an ascending colon, we call it. There's the transverse colon and then the descending colon. By the way, colon is another name for your intestines. So the large colon, also bowel. You might have heard of bowel before. inflammatory bowel disease, or move your bowels or whatever. So bowel is also another name for intestine. Okay, so intestine, colon, bowel. The large intestine actually has a large diameter. It's not that long though. And once the material from your small intestine reaches your large intestine, there's not many nutrients left. Okay, there's some indigestible material like fiber, cellulose. There's a lot of water still left in there. There's some vitamins, and of course, if you're lactose intolerant, there'd actually be lactose left there, right? Because you wouldn't have had the enzyme to digest it in the duodenum. So by the time the material reaches the large intestine, chemical digestion is complete. No more chemical digestion. Most of the absorption is complete. There's still a little bit of fine tuning left to occur though. So there is a picture of the large intestine. You can see that it isn't very long, but it is much larger than the small intestine as far as diameter goes. Okay. Notice this little valve right here. Okay, that's a sphincter that would differentiate the small intestine from the large intestine. Notice it is a ring-like muscle. Okay, sphincters are ring-like muscles. So the material, the digested material and indigestible material from your small intestine would enter in through there. It would move up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, and into this area right here, which is called the rectum. And then this right here is the anus. So the job of the large intestine is to absorb excess water, to absorb water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C, vitamin K. Okay, those are water-soluble. There are fat-soluble vitamins as well. They would have been absorbed earlier on. And then anything else that was missed in the absorption process, such as inorganic compounds like sodium and chloride and potassium and that sort of thing. Now, what's left after a trip through the large intestine is pretty well just stuff that our bodies can't use. So indigestible material, and just excess stuff that we just couldn't absorb, and is now called feces. So in humans, feces is stored in the rectum. There is a sphincter at the bottom of the rectum called the anus that we actually have control over. And this is what your parents spent a lot of time when you were very, very young teaching you how to do, is potty training, right? We have control over that to a certain extent. If our rectums do get completely full, and we ignore the signs, the signals, the nerve signals coming to our brain, our brain will take over, right? People have bowel obstructions, and this is really gross to think about, but a bowel obstruction is basically where the large intestine becomes obstructed for some reason. Sometimes there could be a plug in there. Sometimes in older people, peristalsis isn't as strong anymore. So feces can't be propelled out of the body, and it kind of sits there and hardens and forms a plug. And what can happen is feces can back up, believe it or not, all the way up to the stomach in really severe cases. And I actually have a friend who's a nurse, and sometimes, she'll tell us the grossest stories that she encounters. And with really severe bowel obstructions, if it's ignored, there's actually something known as fecal vomiting, believe it or not, where the feces will back up all the way, and they'll actually vomit up. Yeah, so. I mean, that's in really severe cases. Most of the time, a bowel obstruction is really painful. You go to the hospital, they diagnose it with an ultrasound or an X-ray, and then they'd have to go in and operate and surgically remove the blockage of some sort. Okay, so it's peristalsis that propels the feces through the rectum down to the anus, and then you eliminate it. Now, at the kind of entrance to the large intestine, there is a blind pouch. Scientists believe this is a leftover from our ancestors who would have had a different diet than us and would have required a different arrangement of their digestive system. And this is this blind end here. So again, we're on the lower right hand side of your body. Okay, the small intestine, right? I showed you that sphincter entering into the large intestine right here, and that the ileum of the small intestine would dump your food into the large intestine. Now, this blind end here that doesn't go anywhere, that's known as a cecum. No, you don't have to know that. Okay. And in humans, we have this little tail out the backside of our cecum, and it's known as your appendix. I'm sure everybody's heard of that, right? Now, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't serve any purpose that we know of, and we think it's kind of a leftover from our ancestors. Like I said, it's vestigial. Okay, that means that it doesn't really serve any purpose. So what can happen sometimes with the appendix is feces can back up and it can kind of get impacted inside the appendix. And if a plug forms here, bacteria can start to form inside there, and the bacteria will actually eat away at the wall of that appendix, and it'll cause inflammation and it'll cause an infection. And that's what appendicitis is known as. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. And what appendicitis can end up doing is it can be really severe, and it can actually cause the appendix to burst. And the appendix, if it bursts, all that fecal matter that was inside will burst out into your body cavity, and it can actually, the bad bacteria in there can get into your bloodstream, and it can cause something known as septic shock, and it can kill you. It's very serious. So if you ever have like severe pain down in that right hand side, okay, that lower right hand side, and if you can press it, and when you release, it's really excruciatingly pain, you have a fever, it's warm to the touch, go to the hospital. Don't walk that off. Don't think, oh man, I'm tough, I'm just gonna deal with it. It's just a stomach ache. Okay, pain, right hand side, okay, fever, warm to the touch, hurts to kind of press and release, go to the hospital. Okay, they'll probably have to take your appendix out, or at the very least, give you some antibiotics to deal with the infection. All right, so be real careful with that one. Anybody in here ever have appendicitis? The odd time I get a student who's had to have their appendix out. Any of your parents or anything? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've had lots of friends that have had a lot of things happen to them. Never, I don't know anybody who's ever had their appendix out. So that's a new one. Was it kind of an emergency? Like, oh crap, I'm not feeling good, I got to go to the hospital. Oh, a long time ago, both of them. How about you? Same kind of deal. Oh, so how did it flare up? Like, what happened? But it was pretty obviously like something's wrong here. I got to go to the hospital. Yeah. Okay. So don't ignore that. Okay. And don't worry, I don't have an appendix operation like this, so nobody has to hide their heads through any gore. But you can see that it's being done the same way, right? Arthroscopically, so they're not opening the person right up. Now, something that's really become more and more evident to the medical community, and more important, as it turns out, is the community of bacteria that live in your large intestine. Believe it or not, we actually have more bacteria living in our bodies than we have cells of our body. You are more bacteria than you are you, as far as cell count. It's mind-blowing to think that we have this entire ecosystem living inside of our colons. And it's actually really, really important. Like they're saying that our microbiome, they call it the microbiome, in our large intestine might contribute to things like depression, schizophrenia, obesity, ADHD. Like they're thinking that there are major implications of our microbiome to our overall health. Have you guys ever heard of probiotics? right? What would be an example of a food that's a probiotic? Yogurt, yeah. Especially like the is it the Greek yogurt that's kind of unpasteurized, right? Like the same with things like sauerkraut and kimchi and all of these fermented foods. They're filled with bacteria, and it's not the bacteria that's going to kill you. That's going to cause food poisoning. It's actually good bacteria, and I don't know if your doctors have ever given you a prescription for an antibiotic. But antibiotics, not only do they kill harmful bacteria, but they'll also kill the good bacteria in your bowels, and that can cause you to have upset stomachs and cause you to have diarrhea and all sorts of nasty side effects. And what a lot of doctors will say is, okay, when you're taking these antibiotics, make sure you eat a lot of yogurt and fermented foods to help reestablish that colony of bacteria in your bowels.